everyone, and welcome back. I'm so happy to see all of you, and I'm really excited about today's expert. It seems like every time I turn on the news today, there are still conversations about policy. It's what we said the last time we had Mr. Brown with us, and it's still true today. What policy is President Biden considering? What has his policy been so far? What will his policy be? What's exciting, at least for me, and I think for a lot of you, is that for the first time in a while, a lot of these policy discussions have been around the importance of both science and education. We came together early this year to draft a policy memo for the Biden administration, and we have our guest expert back today to talk to us a little bit about next steps, what we can expect, and what we should be doing and thinking about as we move forward. James Brown is the executive director of the STEM Ed Policy Coalition. Prior to joining the coalition, he was director of advocacy at the American Chemical Society, a nuclear engineer by training. He previously worked as legislative aide for Representative Doc Hastings of Washington, was director of policy and development at the Consumer Energy Council of America, and began his career as an engineer with Newport News Shipbuilding, working on aircraft carrier construction. He received a BS from the University of New Mexico and an MS from Penn State, both in nuclear engineering. He also holds an MBA from George Washington University. Now, a lot of what we're going to be doing today is taking your questions. So please make sure to use that Q&A button. See it down at the bottom. Go ahead and click on it now. Make sure that you know where it is. We encourage you to chat over in the chat window as well, share resources and back channel. But make sure to put your questions for James in that Q&A button. And even if you don't have a question yourself, keep an eye there because you can go ahead and vote those up if you see a question that's really relevant to your work, and it'll be sort of more likely that that's a question that we're able to ask today. So James, welcome. We submitted our memo. By all accounts, it was well received. What should we be considering as the next steps to ensure that this work keeps moving forward?
Well, we're nearing the end of the first 100 days of President Biden's term. And you can see the elements of an agenda for his administration taking shape on multiple different fronts. And so one of those fronts is obviously the need to confirm people in the administration. And you've seen that happen, since the last time we met in February. You've seen most of the government start to take firm shape. So you have people in budget positions in the White House. You have people running agencies now. They're starting to confirm the assistant secretaries and the undersecretaries and the rest of the parts of government. And you're seeing now with the Education Secretary Cardona in office for a little over a month now, you're starting to see a profusion of plans out of the Department of Education around education priorities, mainly focused on opening of schools. But you've also probably seen a shift as the president has started to talk about recovery and not just the immediate dealing with the virus. And so you'll see plans for infrastructure and competitiveness and other elements that touch very closely upon STEM education starting to come together. The other piece that's out there that at the White House that I think is particularly important is we're moving closer to have a confirmed head of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And those folks in the White House are starting to fill out their operation handling a whole host of science and technology issues that go beyond the coronavirus and deal with employment and shifts in trends in how areas like cybersecurity and national security and the interface that they have with STEM education is coming together. And interestingly, you're starting to see the president also appear in certain science and technology settings for the first time. So he spoke to the folks at NASA running the Perseverance rover. So you're starting to see the elements of an administration agenda come together. And I really think over the summer, you will see additional developments along these lines.
You mentioned that the OST position is hopefully close to being filled. I wonder if you have any sense of what might be kind of the top priorities for that position once it is confirmed and that work can begin.
Well, so Dr. Eric Lander, who's currently the head of the Broad Institute at MIT, is the nominee for the president's science advisor. And he has been elevated to a cabinet appointment, which is different and probably slowing down his confirmation compared to prior people in that job. But when he's in office, he will preside over an administration policy that's expansive on the science front, right? I mean, never before have we seen really an emphasis on science be so prominent at the start of an administration. And they really have a job that's on several fronts. The first is to make sure all of the rescue dollars that are flowing out to states are well spent. This is very similar to what happened in President Obama's first term with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, when they were focused on making sure science agencies and others were spending those dollars effectively. So you will probably see some communiques from the National Science Foundation, NIH, other granting agencies focusing on leveraging recovery dollars in different ways, whether it's working with their state health departments or other things along those lines. So that's one priority, I think, the new science apparatus that the White House will have. The second is there are a number of emerging areas that intersect with the so-called competitiveness conversation about how you can bring additional jobs in the United States, additional investment in areas like semiconductor manufacturing, for example, pharmaceutical manufacturing, other areas where the United States has somewhat fallen behind, and we've recognized our dependence upon supplies around the world that aren't always on our side or available. So I think that's kind of a second front where you'll see the attention of the White House and specifically the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And the third is an interesting emergence in employment. You will see that that unemployment is unusually high amongst what we might term low-skilled workers, but unemployment is reaching critical lows and shortage conditions in certain skilled trades. For example, in aviation, as aviation goes back to work, technicians are in demand in lots of manufacturing sectors, and that's an area where, if you talk to an airline maintenance company, for example, they'll say we're having a really hard time hiring people who can fix our planes because they've gone back to work in other sectors that started up sooner. So you're seeing a shortage of skilled trades, especially in the STEM high technology areas. And you're also seeing at the same time rising unemployment amongst those with lesser skills. So I really expect, again, the White House to focus on helping to both mitigate those shortages and also work on elevating the skills of the people who are having a hard time finding a job, getting back into the economy.
I really wonder. I wonder what that might look like, and I wonder if you have any sense. I feel like sort of an interesting problem and a semi-novel one, at least for my lifetime. This issue of too many jobs for some of our skilled workers. How might the White House alleviate those problems? And are there things that we should be thinking about as regional ecosystems to help that same effort?
Well, now we're talking about things that are very near and dear to all of our hearts as STEM advocates, right? One of the challenges, and it's an opportunity too, is the fact that if we play back the tape a little bit, when the latest incarnation of the federal education law that replaced No Child Left Behind, the Every Student Succeeds Act, went into place in 2015, it required every state to do a needs assessment of its workforce needs, both current and longer term, and to show how federal education dollars were being used to address those needs. Now we've just had this huge burst of federal funds, what amounts to about 4 years worth of federal funds being pumped out to states in a very short period of time. However, the states are not required to do any formal needs assessment around how those dollars would be lined up with workforce needs. And I think it's an especially poignant challenge now if you're a superintendent or a state education department head, to anticipate how to use those dollars in ways that put people back to work, not just get schools back to open. And so I think an important role for the STEM ecosystems going forward is to be the conduit of those needs to state policymakers in a way that show we've thought through what those workforce needs are. We've got some sensitivity and some ears to the ground on what our employers are saying, and that we help understand how schools and K-12 systems in particular can be lined up so that they're helping to meet those particular skill needs. And one of them is certainly the emergence of digital skills as a very, very prominent element in a strategy to get people into jobs. That's probably the biggest differentiator in the current economy, is people with digital literacy are doing much, much better than people without it.
As ecosystems are starting to think about that and support that, is that a situation where they should be cold calling policy leaders, or is there a better way for people to reach out and start to get those voices heard in cases where the ecosystem doesn't already have a standing relationship with local and federal lawmakers?
Well, this is definitely something that we, in particular, our coalition, its members, can help with. Any outreach to policymakers is always valuable, but the most is built upon relationships. And I bet you if you asked any of the ecosystems on this call or any of your family of ecosystems to name the top policymakers they have connections with, all of them would have some answers. And we can help make those answers better by using our network of connections to amplify some of the things they're doing. But let me just talk a little bit about who I think the important decision makers are. So if you look across the states, every governor's office has somebody whose job it is to focus on the interactions of education and employment, whether it's an economic advisor, a science and technology person, or somebody who's involved in their state STEM. A lot of the governors have state STEM organizations of some kind or STEM councils. That's one place to look, because governors are going to play a huge role in terms of setting the course for their state's direction of both recovery and the use of federal dollars. And they're kind of two different areas, right? There's the need to allocate these federal dollars over the next couple of years, but also every state has its own plan using its own resources to engage in recovery. And that's where a lot of the dealing with equity and diversity and some of the lost communities, if you will, due to the pandemic are going to have. So governors are very important. State departments of education are also very important, and they all have ears to the ground and touch points to interact with our communities. And then the other part of this is your local education officials, your superintendents and school boards are also some of the people who are challenged the most, because they're having to make very high stakes decisions about how they're going to allocate these federal dollars. And it's a double-edged sword not being required to consult with the communities they live in, right? If you went to any superintendent and said, hey, you can make all these decisions themselves, they'd probably say, well, that's great. And then they think about it a little bit, and then they realize that's an enormous responsibility too. So I think they would welcome input from groups like the STEM ecosystems about priorities, as long as they're pitched in a way that shows that you understand the challenges that school districts have, right? Because STEM education is not the only thing they're focused on, right? It's like you're looking at somebody who's fighting a fire in their house, and they're trying to spray water on the fire, and you're trying to already talk about how they're rebuilding their house, right? So I think you've got to be sensitive to that, but I think there's a big role for the ecosystems to play, and I'm hoping that we can do as much as we can to amplify their voices over the next couple of years.
I'd love to, if you don't mind, James, in a minute, sort of step through what that might look like for an individual ecosystem. What kind of steps and things they might do. But before we do that, I'm curious about something that you mentioned earlier. You mentioned something we've been seeing in the news, that the head of OST is being elevated to a cabinet level position. And one downside to that, of course, is that confirmation is probably taking a little bit longer than it would otherwise. But I'm wondering what the benefits are, in particular nationally, but in particular to us. What is the benefit to the STEM world of the OST head being a cabinet level position?
Well, I'll give you what I think is a good example of the influence of elevating that particular function. So if you look around at what's going on Capitol Hill right now, there's two big debates going on. One's on infrastructure and the other's on competitiveness and the US-China relationship. And a really important voice in that conversation has been MIT, of which Eric Lander is from. And it's not a coincidence that MIT is leading a conversation to elevate science and technology in the federal government in ways that we haven't talked about since really the space program in the 50s. There's something called the Endless Frontiers Act, which was authored out of the MIT Washington office. Again, a connection back to Eric Lander and his brain trust there, that proposes $40 billion in new funding for the National Science Foundation. Now, that's several multiples of the current budget for the National Science Foundation. So having somebody who is going to have the president's ear and play a much larger role in policy than prior is part of the reason why you have this very, very robust conversation going on about science and technology and competitiveness. And you're shining light on the workforce discrepancies I talked about earlier, at the very highest levels of policymaking, rather than sort of relegating them to a secondary issue, which is how that position and those issues have played out for most of our history, except for when we really, really needed it.
I do wonder, as a potential small downside, I think it's a worthwhile trade that in the past, the head of OST has been a relatively easy position to get in touch with and to speak to. And I do wonder how much this raises that bar of difficulty for individual ecosystems who might not have a direct and tight tie to the administration to interact.
Well, one of the things that we've done is, we've dealt with presidential administrations around the STEM education issue. We meaning the STEM Ed Coalition, going back to President W. Bush, right? So this has been an issue that's been in play for a long time now, and you know, each White House has its own particular bent on this issue, but one of the things they've done a better job is of listening to our community, right? So if you look at what the Trump administration did in terms of putting together a long-term strategic plan, they developed a lot of ways of communicating with our community. In fact, I'm looking at the names of the participants, and I know many of them were in the room when that administration helped develop its plans, right? I don't think that's going to become any less of a listening tool. I think this administration is looking for ways they can amplify that formal process. And by the same token, I think they're also interested in new ideas. And that's where I think we have a role to play in terms of, it's hard to pilot new things when the federal government doesn't have a lot of resources. Well, I would be one of the first to assert we might almost have too many resources at the federal government's disposal right now, because it's just as much of a challenge to efficiently spend trillions of dollars as it is to figure out where to get money to fund things that cost a few $1 million, right? So part of what their challenge will be is looking for new ideas that can operate at scale. And I think the ecosystems are a very good voice for bringing forward the ideas you've seen that have worked in different areas of the STEM equation, and really trying to amplify them rather than just investing in a few new things around the edges. We've got to think big and be able to put good ideas in front of policymakers, both federally, and that same thing applies to governors and state departments and people on down the line.
So what I'm hoping that we can do now, James, is talk a little bit more kind of tangibly about what steps ecosystems and ecosystem leaders can make. As you're aware, this is not a large group in attendance, but the folks here are leading big initiatives. So they've got a lot of ideas and resources at their disposal. And I think that the first thing that people need to do is sort of know what's happening.
Right.
Carrie, can you ask your question?
Yeah, we're all busy. We all have our day jobs, and we're trying to keep an eye on what's going on. And I'm just wondering if you have a good source for us to keep an eye on to really see what the emerging policies are and what's happening.
Well, I think we're right about the first topic here, which is how well do we know what's going on in our state or our locality or our ecosystem, and what does that mean for education, right? There are many different ways to look for that, right? One of the best places for the workforce needs is your state chamber of commerce. And boy, are they sensitized now to some of these business issues. So one of the things I would point out is if you don't already have them in your circle, there is an education person in every state chamber of commerce that's poised to understand the STEM education issues and is worth renewing that conversation if it doesn't exist, or amplifying it. That's one place I would look. And then, there are a number of other resources that are available to you in the STEM education world. So there are scorecards on your teacher evaluations. There are indicators on things like student performance you can look to. And I think you're going to have to do some legwork to sort of show this, because whether your ecosystem has done it, there are other STEM organizations in your state that you can look to, other STEM ed coalitions. The National Science Teachers Association chapters in your states generally have these. There are professional societies you can turn to. And so I think this is where, and we can help you with this. So if you have nowhere to start, set up one of the consultations with our organization that we send out every month or two, and we can help you talk about this, because I guarantee you there's somebody thinking about this in every single state.
James, the next thing, at least in my mind, as we think about this past year, is that, all right, so we've got our ear to the ground, we're learning about what the opportunities are. But there's also this ongoing critical thread on diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice. And I know that there's a new NSF opportunity that was just announced, gosh, I think yesterday, the day before, very, very recently. Jan, can you tell us a little bit about that opportunity? Because I wonder if it's something that we should be thinking about either as a broad ecosystem in conjunction with the individual locals. Are you there, Jan? Jan is maybe frozen. I think you're frozen, Jan. So while Jan figures that out, hopefully, James, what can you tell us about the importance of equity and DEI to this administration, and how critical it is that we cover those bases as we're thinking about shifts in policy?
Well, it's obviously a super critical issue now. We live at a time where the pandemic has opened and exposed inadequacies in our economy, in our education system, and all of the discrepancies that result from that. And they've really been, rend before our eyes as the challenges that people have, both with digital access and career access, and the ability to work from home and the ability to have childcare. All of these are amplifying factors that have really been a challenge for people who didn't have a lot of means before the pandemic started. So it's only underscored that need. One trend we've definitely seen is that if you look at corporate philanthropy in STEM education, almost to a dime, it is focused on diversity and inclusion. And that's also because, let me give you a concrete example of a business case we need to make for diversity and inclusion. Think about this one for a second. So if you talk to a big defense contractor nowadays, one of the things they'll cite is the inability to hire Americans who are capable of going through the background check for national security clearances. And that's because they're not reaching out to enough of a pool of students to find people who can fill those jobs and who can have security clearances at the same time. If we can't fill those jobs, it's really a challenge to maintain our national security at a time when the world is a pretty dangerous place out there. So you can make both a business case and you can both make a civil rights case for the need for equity and making sure you're not leaving talent behind as you move forward in this space. So that just establishes the case. But I think there's another conversation to be had about what can we really do about it. And I give you an example of something that we can all learn from, and that's how digital internships, virtual internships, have helped level the playing field in ways we did not expect. So again, if you talk to a Texas Instruments or a Microsoft, the companies who have huge numbers of internships, they'd say the pool of offerings for virtual internships was much more diverse this year than it has been in prior years. And that's in some ways a little bit unusual or unexpected as a result, but it's because people didn't have to travel, they didn't have to establish a place to live somewhere else, and they could participate based upon their interests. That gives you some fuel for thought for how to build programs that are more inclusive in the future and that provide more opportunities like that going forward.
Jan, I was just about to ask you, when I think your internet went out, about this new initiative that I know you've got your ear to the ground on. I see that your internet's still a little bit slow, so I'm gonna go ahead and turn your video off. Don't take it personally. And I'm hoping that James is just talking about the critical need and the both kind of social case, but also the business case for focusing on DEI and social justice. What can you tell us about this new NSF opportunity?
Well, I think, Jeremy, first of all, please let me know if you can't hear me. NSF just released an RFP talking about STEM education and equity. And if the first thing that you see when you open up the solicitation is you see the list of cognizant program officers with a list that is a who's who in NSF. It is cross-cutting every directorate, content directorates as well. And the whole notion of broadening participation with much more expansion. The second thing you notice is that they're very serious about this not being the gross scale of existing programming that might or might not be useful in the field as a STEM tool or instrument, but let alone in breaking through processes that can support equity. So the whole RFP is a very serious endeavor. It's huge in that it has requirements and bottom lines and foundational thinking that will help the dialogue and the discourse, even if we're not applying. And I think what it's actually doing is it's enabling the voices from the field and what is in the field to come forth and to be recognized in ways that the nation needs to know, and with processes that can be researched.
So Jane, do you think this is, I know it's probably pretty early stage, so I apologize if I put you on the spot here. But do you think there's a role within that new RFP for the ecosystem initiative to be addressing these needs?
it's interesting, Jeremy, and also James, it's really would be interesting to hear your perspective. But when you look at who's eligible, rarely do we see the term municipality listed, and municipality is listed. And the whole eligibility categories are very different than what we normally see. Normally it's higher education, it's nonprofits, it's, da, 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 da. And, that's a standard pathway for NSF. Clearly, there has been enormous thought, and there's been real iteration around the focus of where the NSF wants to be, the role that they want to play. And remember, they have a new director, and they have a number of new folks that are there who are it's not as if that this is new to their professional commitment. They have been elevated to NSF because it has been their life's work. And that's, again, very different. So yes, the answer is yes. And as always, best thinking is when we collaborate to empowerment, when we think together, even if we go out alone, when we think together and we imagine together and we take our best shot at it. I think it has more value to everybody involved.
This is probably rude of me, Jan, but as you were talking, I was Googling this RFP, and boy, does this really seem like that they almost had the ecosystem initiative in mind. I think there's so many really critical opportunities here that I'm excited to explore, and I'm sure we'll be hearing more from you or Alyssa or Veronica as that kind of moves forward. But
right, so Jeremy, let me mention one thing. I do think that we're going to try to get potential on Friday, get a call together for all of us to be thinking and speaking about it. And I know that Alyssa, Veronica, and the whole team is working on that. But I would say this in isolation is not going to be anywhere as powerful as if we collaborate with James, and that we understand the STEM coalition and what they're driving with the Hill and with the administration. NSF is its own agency and will always put out something that's in its own enlightened self-interest. If we seek to network this and create a fabric in which this sits, I think the power is unyielding.
And James, you probably didn't know that you're going to be on camera while partnership opportunities were brought up, but I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think that there's a really good fit there. All right, so we're learning more about policy by talking to our state and local leaders. Some new opportunities that James mentioned, like chambers of commerce and so forth. We know that DEI is an important hallmark of the administration policy. So I think that the next thing that we want to be thinking about as we're sort of stepping through this is how we as individual ecosystems and as a national initiative, but in particular as individual ecosystems, can start to pull the resources from the federal government and also the voices from the federal government in. And so with that, Tom Peters, sorry, Tom, I had to quickly look at your last name again, had a question that I think makes sense. Tom, are you there? Can you ask your question?
Yeah, I'm here. So I wouldn't be here if it was not for the National Science Foundation's statewide systemic initiatives back in the early 1990s. At that time, they were creating something from nothing to support math and science education. There's no longer a need to create something from nothing because there are so many ecosystems. Our ecosystem, like probably every other one, struggles with maintaining its infrastructure. So I'm wondering if there are any possibilities for the federal government to support existing STEM infrastructure.
So, Tom, always nice to talk with you. I think,
Likewise.
So let me just go back one step. So this new solicitation for NSF is part of a theme you're going to see across the government going forward around community-based partnerships around health, around education, and around employment. And this is built upon a lot of different lessons that have been shared across the federal government around this notion of, let me just start with community health as a model and explain why you're seeing NSF start to adopt these strategies. So gosh, for the last 3 or 4 months, the focus has been on vaccinations, right? And forever, community health advocates have been trying to get companies to encourage their employees to get the flu vaccine. Well, COVID is several thousand multiples more intense in terms of the focus on that. And so now you're seeing really good partnerships between employers and community health organizations to get their employees vaccinated, and they understand the value of doing that. Well, that same thinking is emerging in NSF, it's emerging in NASA's education programs, it's emerging in the after school community around the value of engaging community partners in educational outcomes. And so this is really the first of, I think, what you'll see are many efforts at NSF to leverage networks like the STEM ecosystems and others that have big, broad community networks that have never really been engaged as partners in education at this kind of volume. And I think now that we're shifting between the rescue phase where we're getting past COVID and we're getting into the recovery phase where we're looking at the building of America back, I think you're going to only see more emphasis on leveraging the power of groups like the STEM ecosystems and other community partners that bring together business, education, and the professions that can be assets to state education officials in ways that we've never really tried before. And let me just give you a concrete example. So one of the challenges that state education officials have is they have very little capacity to do needs assessments like those, which the ecosystems have really a lot of potential to be able to do if you meet Tom's challenge of them having the infrastructure to do it. So there's definitely a pathway of us creating more resources for ecosystems to be able to use grants like this NSF grant and potentially things down the road that could be included in some of these very, very large plans around economic recovery that could really leverage those possibilities. So I think that's definitely a possibility going forward. And it's something that the administration, I think, has embraced in principle, if not in these particulars.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that question. All right. So if we think about that sort of progression, James, of learning more, that focus on DEI, the conversation that you just had with Tom, what else do we need to be thinking about? What other sort of specific, tangible things can people be working on in the short term? Is there anything else, or is that?
So I will assert that one of the things that ecosystems could do to get smarter on this whole landscape is really understand what you can use federal dollars for at the state level. And this is a big challenge because during the 15 years of No Child Left Behind, there was very little discretion at the state level for how you could spend federal dollars. And the combination of the shift in 2015 to the Every Student Succeeds Act, and especially now with the previous relief packages and the American Rescue Plan, almost all the decisions about priorities for federal dollars are left at the hands of state and local education officials. And I have a crude analogy here, but I think it's the right one, which is, if you walked into Alcatraz in 1940 and you opened all the doors and you said, get out there and make something of yourself, man, those people have been in there a long time. They may not remember how to do things differently. And I think one of the challenges that state education departments have is, again, their house has been on fire for the past year. They're not thinking about innovative ways to go forward at any kind of scale. They are still in crisis mode. But one of the things we can help them with is sharing examples of things that they could use on the downside of these federal dollars that would be more effective at improving diversity, would be more effective at delivering hands-on opportunities for kids or getting them into high quality after school programs or things of the like. We have to find a way to cut through the noise. And the task here is, if every ecosystem could just spend, a portion of their time getting smart on what these federal dollars can and can't be used for, there are ways to learn that. We can help you with that. There are good guides out there. Just knowing what you can ask your state of education officials and your superintendent and your school board. Hey, did you think about using these recovery dollars, these Rescue Act dollars that you got? And by the way, your state got $7 or $8 billion in federal aid in the last 6 months. Do you think about using them on a FIRST robotics program? Do you think about using them on, a citizen science initiative? Or do you think about, buying some new resources for science classrooms, right? I could go on and on and on. Those are all things you can use those dollars for that I don't think the schools understand that well. And I don't think the teachers understand that well, but we could understand that pretty well.
And this gets back to your earlier point that in some ways we have a new difficulty of too many resources, and perhaps even people we've talked to in the past who weren't receptive might be more because they've got resources that they need to allocate.
Yeah, I mean, it's a new challenge, right? And part of it is when you've got a lot of resources to spend, you're also looking at things you can do at scale. And that is another, aspect about learning how we can use these funds. I think we have to think a little bit bigger in terms of what we might do as well. It's not the next 1,000 or the next million. It's thinking in terms of things that could be statewide initiatives, for example. Like, I'll give you a great example. You know, I'll just single out FIRST for a minute. Like, just think about what it would cost to put a FIRST team in every school, right? Like, if that's the thing your ecosystem cares about, then that's something you do, right? Think about what it would cost to equip every science laboratory with AP chemistry capability, right? Think about what would it cost to have, an hour of code deployed across your whole school district. All of these things are all, think about examples of stuff that you liked, but you didn't have enough of. Imagine, doing that across an entire jurisdiction. That's the level of thinking we should have.
So James, I sometimes ask what maybe are dumb questions, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because I feel like a lot of people in this room already know the answer to this, but I don't, and I have the microphone, so I'm going to ask. How do we find out what qualifies? I mean, I understand that there's these, giant documents that I'm not smart enough to read, but how can I actually find out in a reasonable way, if I'm going to meet with somebody, what types of things would work and would qualify?
Well, I'll give you a little rundown just so we can get this started, right? Because there are a lot of guides out there. We can figure out between us and the TIES team how to share some of this around. But here's an example. So any function that was already authorized under the Every Student Succeeds Act, you can use the recovery funds for. So let me just start there, right? So if schools were spending federal dollars on it last year, they can spend these new funds on it this year, and there's a lot more money to spend on it, right? They can spend it on education technology. They can spend it on physical resources for classrooms. They can spend it on teacher professional development. So think about all the prospects for leveraging training around NGSS. There are all sorts of opportunities around just the things that I talked about, right? There's a portion of these funds that are set aside for summer learning programs. There's a portion of these funds that are set aside for after-school programs. So, anything that was fair game before is still fair game. That's part of the challenge, right? Is that these dollars are not earmarked for any particular function. So it's the same challenge we had before, only, we would be foolish if we ever took no for an answer if we don't have the resources to do that from a state superintendent. The answer is you do have the resources to do it now, and you just need to prioritize this area.
All right, so let's talk about a hypothetical that's sort of in line with what you're saying. I'm an ecosystem leader. I have some relationships with school districts. I have some relationships with out-of-school time organizations, but they're loose connections. But I know about a really great opportunity. Like there's this Robotify Mars challenge that the SLE-COP is involved in. How do I go about trying to get it for all students in my region? So I'm, again, not thinking at the national level. I'm a local leader. I know about this cool opportunity. Who should my first call be, and what should I follow to try to make that happen?
Well, so, a good starting point for that, just to give you a little preview. So it's various different points in the past, we have done what we might call a dear colleague letter from national organizations to state policymakers, elaborating on all the things I just talked about that you could use funding for, right? And when we've consulted with the various ecosystems, some of them who are on the call and state after school networks and so forth, we've encouraged people, try and do the same thing where you can see if you're an ecosystem and you're not involved with your local after school network, your state after school network, let's have a discussion with them and see what we might jointly recommend to the governor and the State Department of Education, maybe to our legislature, right? Can we recommend a specific item that we both hold in common? Or can we agree to support each other's priorities in the STEM arena in our respective areas? That's a pretty, productive conversation most of the time. And if you don't know who those folks are, your counterparts, just in that one community, for example, or you don't know who some of the other STEM organizations are, or your state science teachers organization, those are connections we can help you make. So that's where I would start, is think about who's your closest partner in the policy arena that's a different STEM group, right? And I'd start there. And if you can just get it down to, hey, I'll go back to the robotics. You used robotics there, right? If you can just think about one program you think is valuable, what's something we could agree on, right? Is it just having more emphasis in your summer learning programs, right? Like that one thing you can start with. I think that's where I would go, because you can imagine that every ecosystem is going to have some single programmatic activity they're going to agree, hey, this is pretty worth supporting. Maybe go back to the things you looked at. If you have some history, go back to the things you looked at 5 or 6 years ago when probably the answer was, we can't afford this, right? That's no longer, that is no longer a constraint.
So James, all the things that you're talking about, really speak to all of us, but they also bring something up. So we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice. We're talking about this opportunity to bring potentially really great programs and programming to kids at a statewide level or a huge region. But there's a big stumbling block there, and it's a big passion of ours and of mine. John, can you ask your question?
Yeah, I'm just curious, with digital literacy and connectivity becoming increasingly important, really critical, I'm wondering what the emphasis of the Biden administration is on providing that. I come from a very rural state where we have some students that have no connectivity, others on dial-up. And I'm just wondering if there's going to be a federal emphasis or if that's going to fall primarily on the states.
Well, so John, one of the pools of money that's in the rescue plan is $7.6 billion for broadband deployment at the state level. So that's the first place to look. And in terms of their agenda going, and that's an allocation of funds that every single state's going to get. So there's going to be at least a few $100 million, depending on your state and its size, something of that order will be available for that purpose going across all the different states. So that's the first place you want to look. And the instructions for that are either going to be on the governor's website or on your state Department of Education website, or in some states, it's in the Commerce/Labor Department. But there will be instructions for how a school district or community organization partners would be available to access those funds. The second part of this is, if you haven't looked yet, you might want to look at the American Recovery Plan that the Biden administration's put out for infrastructure. This is the $2.25 trillion federal infrastructure plan that's now being considered by Congress. And there are lots of digital infrastructure and digital skills oriented aspects to that. And that is definitely something we're working on pushing to make sure there's some more support for some of the things we've talked about on this call are explicitly included in that plan. So that's kind of where this is going. And there's definitely opportunities on the table already.
Thank you for that, John. So the whole issue of connectivity is one that's actually engaged some business and industry as well. And this brings up a question about partnerships and how important will partnerships be important for the administration for funding opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. Will partnerships be valued? Are you seeing signals that our core values, that's one of the, that's arguably the core value of the STEM ecosystems, is bringing people together? Is that a core value of this administration? Is that beneficial? Is that something that we should be thinking about and addressing when we're making these arguments for funding and requests?
Well, I'll go back to something I touched on earlier. It's already well embedded in their strategy around community health. And you can expect more announcements like what you saw out of NSF in the future. And then I think one of the other areas to look is, so each new administration has guidance they put out on competitive grants at the Department of Education. And that process is just starting with Secretary Cardona. Will shortly be putting out a request for information around the department's priorities. I expect to see that between now and the end of the year, probably sooner rather than later, asking for input on those priorities. And you can bet there's going to be emphasis on community partnerships around education as a part of that. So that's the competitive part of what the department does, which is a small piece of a very large pie. But I also expect, this forthcoming infrastructure package, we're calling it infrastructure, but really it's a recovery and jobs creating vehicle that the administration sees. And I think you're going to see a very, very heavy emphasis on the community partnership as a driver for both local economic development and for educational capacity building as well, because it's a vehicle for addressing some of the shortages in specific areas we talked about. And I think you're going to see those policies be heavily embedded in community partnerships to address them.
John, you're talking about Secretary Cardona, and I was just going to ask Patty Curtis, because she's talking in the back channel, but it looks like she may be left because I don't see her there anymore, to share some of the things she's talking about. However, if you're participating today, go ahead and look through and make sure you're reading that chat. There's some interesting nuggets that Patty just mentioned there. Sorry, I'm reading a couple of things. Jan Morrison is also mentioning that Melissa Moritz was just joined the Department of Education as a STEM Next Fellow for after school. She arrived there this week and is one of 5. There's openings and applications for more of those positions at STEM Next. While I'm kind of mentioning that Jan Morrison thing, I also want to mention that she said earlier that there was going to be a meeting maybe as early as this Friday. I think it's actually not going to be this Friday, but you can expect to get an email sometime this week that will outline what the next steps are for participation in that NSF opportunity. James, we're going to wrap up here pretty quickly. I think there might be another question or two, but before we wrap up, I want to make sure, and before we go to those questions, in case we run out of time, I want to make sure that there aren't things that you're thinking about that are particularly critical for us to be considering beyond what we've discussed now.
Well, I think we're hopefully, I mean, I always keep my fingers crossed about the fact that vaccinations are going well and we're all heading in the right direction. But I think, we're heading towards a summer where we're going to see the first efforts at genuine summer experiences. We're going to see, I think, some tension between governors asking for the summer learning space to be academic and summer programs that want to be fun and experiential, right? That's something I think we have to be fairly patient with and balance our expectations around. And we're going into another school year where we're probably going to see a lot of hybrid learning. But I think the next big policy threshold for making a lot of decisions that are going to matter for us is going to be what the 22-23 school year looks like. I think I've got, my eyes on what will our accountability system look like? What will we be measuring that we've learned is much more important to measure now than we were measuring there? What will be the ways in which we use that data to drive equity in schools? And we look at sort of reimagining what we mean by a good STEM education in light of the disparities in employment and the ethnic and racial issues that we've talked about and how they play into that. And I really think that the concept of what we measure and where we look to metrics for success is going to be maybe the behind the scenes conversation, but I think a super important one as to where do we go with the accountability system and what do we end up doing, both in, think about college admissions and how much disruption there is there. I think you're going to see a conversation about that changing, and that's going to control what high school looks like to a great extent. But that's where I'd keep my eye if I were looking for sort of the next issue that's beyond the horizon of, now we've gotten through what we'll call the rescue phase and we're into the recovery phase. My eyes are on what I don't know what to call it yet. Maybe it's normal, but that phase of what happens when we get back to an in-school world where we can try some new things at scale and hopefully put these big federal funds to work.
Yeah, and sort of related to that, James, I think the two things that a lot of folks are talking about that get to that point are, number one, what was the learning loss this past year? We know it happened, but we don't know how big and how to address it, number one. And number two, and to me, the most important as an educator, the most important is that this is the first time, at least in my career, that we've had an opportunity to experiment on children at a national scale. What that means is that for the first time in a really long time, we've had these labs all over the country of different ways to learn, different ways to teach. And if we just go back to normal, we have messed up the silver lining in all of this. This is our opportunity to really think about what changed and changed better, and what can be continued to deployed to our kids to make sure that each of our students has the learning opportunities that they all deserve. And that's what I'm kind of frankly excited for in this next year is sort of compressing those lessons and turning them into hopefully a new ongoing way to teach and learn.
Well, I think that's very well said. And I think that's a challenge that is really the call to action for our community, is we have to have our eyes on that horizon of how do we learn from this and do something better as we move into that next phase of American life. And I think, that's the challenge for us over the next couple of years, is to really, we have a renewed opportunity to do things differently that we do not have to take no for an answer on. And it will probably not last as long as we think.
So we're living in an interesting time where we have a president and administration that is valuing science. Several historians and journalists have likened President Biden to former President Roosevelt in terms of how they're looking at the value of science and the importance of it to key advancements. FDR sought recommendations on how the government could promote the research of private and public organizations. 75 years later, President Biden is asking for new ways to ensure that the U.S. is the world leader in the technologies and industries of the future, as well as protecting the health of the world's citizens. So our challenge will be to keep this conversation going. But more than that, we need to coalesce and follow the steps that James sketched and rely on the community of practice for both strength in numbers as well as actionable strategies. We're excited to keep this conversation going, to help facilitate practice groups of people who are interested in working together to help change policy and bring resources to your STEM work in your communities. Some things that I learned today that I think we all need to be considering over the coming months. Number one, reach out to local, state, and federal policy leaders who can help you learn what is needed and in what ways ecosystems can support. Number two, a focus on DEI and social justice. It's an administrative policy, and it makes, as James said, just good business sense. Number three, focus on partnerships. It's a focus for this administration, and it's something that we do really well. Maybe nobody does better. And number four, understanding how federal resources can be used. James and the TIES team will be sharing that information with you. And as I mentioned before, we'll be letting you know a date and time for the conversation about the NSF opportunity. Our deepest thanks to James Brown for offering us such good guidance and insight. And thanks to all of you for your great questions, your work, and your dedication to making life and work better for our children and for all of us. Thanks, everyone.